Della Marsh, the widow the valley's fine ladies called nothing but the laundress, counted $80 in cold silver into the richest hand in Cold Fork at midnight. And she never told a living soul. She didn't gloat. She didn't crow. She wrote it down small, in a book only her own eyes had ever read. 2 weeks later, at the Harvest Social, 40 guests raised their glasses to Elias Crandall, the pillar of the valley, they called him, the finest name in Montana territory. And the banker's wife leaned to the deacon and said, "Plain as milk, we don't seat the washwoman with the family." Only Della knew the pillar was hollow clean through. Only Della knew the great man owed her. Then that great man rose from the head table, and he crossed the whole room, past the silver, past the fine folk, straight toward the servants' table in the corner. And the whole valley held its breath. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, if a story like this is worth your evening, take 1 second and subscribe so the next one finds you. And do me a kindness, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels, all the way from Cold Fork to wherever you're sitting tonight. Now, let me take you back to how it started. Cold Fork sat low in a bowl of Montana grass, and the Crandall spread sat high above it. You could stand in the mud of the poor end and look up at that white house on the ridge and feel the whole order of the world laid out plain. Crandall land at the top, the bank in the middle, and down along the creek, where the ground stayed soft and the smell of the tannery drifted on a bad wind, the folks who did the valley's washing and mending and dyeing. Della lived at the bottom. She had not always. She'd come to the territory a bride, 20 years old and certain of things. Her husband had been a good man with a bad chest. The fever took him the winter she turned 30. It took him slow, over 11 days, and it left her with a 2-room house, a milk cow, and a stack of the doctor's bills that stood taller than the sugar tin. She was 30 years old and alone in a country that had no use for a woman alone. She paid the bills off, coin by coin. That is the whole story of the next 8 years, if you want it plain. Coin by coin. She took in mending because her stitches were small and true. She put up preserves that kept through July when other women's went to mold. And when a neighbor came weeping because the miller wanted $3 she didn't have, Della learned the thing that shaped the rest of her life. She learned she had $2 set by. And she learned the neighbor would pay it back at a nickel a week, grateful, and never breathe a word. That was how the poor side of Cold Fork got its bank. Not a building. Not a sign. Just Della Marsh at her table with a candle and a book, lending $1 here and a $half there, taking a hen or a length of good cloth for security, writing each sum down small in a ledger no eye but hers had ever read. She kept every secret that came across that table. A woman's debts are her shame, out here, and Della held 100 shames and told none of them. That was the whole of her worth, and she knew it. She'd learned a woman's only bank is her own discretion. She'd learned it the hard way, the way you learn most true things, and she'd built her whole small life on it. The fine women of Cold Fork looked straight through her. She was used to that. At the mercantile, they'd talk over her head about the church social and the new bolt of blue poplin, and Della would set her mending on the counter and pay her account and go, and to them it was as though a draft had passed through the room. She did not weep about it. She'd wept enough over one grave to last her. Somewhere in those 8 years she had traded softness for something harder and more useful. A private dignity. A spine you could not see but could surely feel if you crossed her. She needed no one. She told herself that most nights, and most nights she believed it. Then came the knock at midnight. It was late October and cold enough that the water in the trough had skinned over. Della was awake. She slept poorly, always had since the fever, and she heard boots on her sagging porch step. One heavy tread, and then a pause, like a man arguing with himself about whether to turn back. Then the knock. Low, almost apologetic. She took up the candle and opened the door on the last man in the valley she expected to see. Elias Crandall filled her doorway. He was a big man gone quiet with trouble, 45 years old, hat in his two hands like a boy called to the front of the church. The wind came in around him and made her candle jump. He did not look at her the way the fine folk looked through her. He looked at her like a drowning man looks at a rope. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. "I've no right to come here. I know it." She stood aside and let him in. She would wonder, later, why she did that without a word. Perhaps because a body who has been looked through learns the exact weight of a man who is truly seeing you, even in his shame. She sat him at her table where all the valley's secrets got told, and she put the kettle on, and she waited. It came out of him in pieces. The drought had started it, 2 summers of grass burned to wire. Then the killing winter, the one they still spoke of, when the snow lay so deep the cattle couldn't paw down to feed, and stood bawling in the drifts until they dropped. The Crandall herd, the pride of the valley, his dead father's whole life's work, had come out of that winter better than half gone. He'd been selling quiet ever since to keep the wages paid. He'd let 2 hands go and worked their share himself in the dark of the mornings so no one would see. And now it was the end of the month, and he had 8 men to pay and $40 to pay them with. And word of an empty Crandall payroll would run to town by supper and from town to the bank, and once the bank knew, he stopped himself there. She noticed it. The way a man steps back from the edge of a hole he didn't mean to show you. "How much?" Della said. He named it. $80. Enough for the wages and a little over to keep up the show a month longer while he found his feet. He could not go to the bank. He would not go to the bank. A Crandall did not borrow, and besides, and here his jaw worked, besides, the bank was not just the bank anymore. She let that lie where he dropped it, and did not pick it up. Not yet. "Why me?" she asked him. "Of all the doors in this valley." He looked at her a long moment. "Because you're the only soul poor enough to need the keeping quiet as bad as I do," he said, "and too proud to talk. I've watched you 8 years, Mrs. Marsh. You've never once told a thing you knew." He turned his hat. "I'm trusting my father's name to that." It was, she thought, the truest and the cruelest thing anyone had said to her in years. He was not asking her because she mattered. He was asking her because she was invisible. And the terrible part, the part that sat in her chest like a swallowed stone, was that being invisible was exactly the thing she had made her whole safety out of. She got up. She had $80. She had a good deal more than $80, scraped and saved a coin at a time across 8 years, hidden where no one would think to look. Every dollar of it a brick in the wall that stood between her and ever needing a man's charity again. She counted 80 of it out onto the table in cold silver, and the counting was the only sound in the room. "Security," she said. "Not a question. A rule of the house. Nobody borrowed off Della Marsh on their word alone, not the miller's wife, and not the pillar of the valley." He understood. He reached into his vest and brought out a watch. It was silver, worn smooth at the stem, his dead father's watch. She could tell by the way he held it, the way a man holds the one thing he'd run back into a fire for. He set it on the table beside the coin and drew his hand back slow. "It keeps good time," he said, and his voice was not steady. "I'll keep it safe," she told him, "and I'll keep it quiet." She took her book from the shelf and opened it and dipped her pen, and by the candle she wrote a single line, small, at the bottom of a page of nickels and hens and $50. $80. E.C. That was all. No spread, no cattle, no ruin, just 2 letters that could hang the finest name in cold fork if the wrong eyes ever read them. And as she blotted the ink she thought of the one other thing he'd let slip and stepped back from. The thing about the bank not being just the bank. She knew a little of it, the way she knew everyone's business, that a landman named Halloran had bought up paper all over the valley. Halloran land and cattle. A man who wanted water more than money. If Halloran already held a piece of Crandall, a second note, a quiet one, behind the first, then $80 was a stone dropped down a well she couldn't see the bottom of. She closed the book. She said nothing. Saying nothing was the whole of her trade. Elias put on his hat. At the door he stopped, and without turning fully round he said, "You'll not be sorry, Mrs. Marsh." And then he was gone into the wind, and the silver watch lay on her table catching the candlelight, ticking soft in the middle of the night like a second small heart. She wound it before she slept. She would tell herself, in the weeks to come, that she wound it only to keep it from stopping, only to keep the security sound. That was a lie, and some part of her knew it even then. The slights got worse that fall, though Della couldn't have said why. Maybe trouble draws a scent. At the mercantile, the banker's wife, a broad woman named Ashford, with a voice built for pronouncing verdicts, took to holding her skirts a little closer when Della passed, as though poverty were a thing you could catch off the cloth. There was talk of the harvest social coming, the biggest doings of the year, the Grange Hall done up with lanterns, and every family of standing there to see and be seen. Della had washed and mended half the dresses that would dance in that hall. She had not once in 8 years been asked to stand inside it, and there was another thing in the wind that fall, and this one Della watched close, though she'd not have admitted to watching. The Ashfords had a way of circling Elias Crandall now. The banker himself would clap him on the shoulder in the street. And the daughter, Genevieve, 26, handsome in the cool way of a girl who has never once wondered where her supper was coming from, Genevieve had taken to riding out toward the Crandall Ridge of an afternoon, side saddle, her habit the color of good money. Della understood it the way she understood most things, quick and without being told. Everyone understood it. The Crandall name and the Ashford Bank. A rescue, dressed up as a romance. If Elias Crandall married the banker's daughter, no one need ever know the herd was half gone, because a bank does not foreclose on its own son-in-law. It was a clean escape. It was the cleanest escape there was. And Della, who held his father's watch in a tin and his secret in a book, watched the trap being built around him board by board, and said nothing. Because it was not her place. Because it was not her business. Because a woman's only bank is her discretion, and the moment she spent a word she'd have nothing left to bank on at all. That is what she told herself. The social came on a cold, clear night with the first hard stars of winter over the valley. Della went because half the poor side went, to serve, to tend the cloakroom, to carry the great dishes the fine women had ordered up and would take the credit for. She'd sewn a small repair into her own good dress, the dark one, the only one, and pressed it careful, and told herself she cared nothing for how she looked among them. They seated her apart. Of course they did. A long table down the side of the hall for the help and the poor relations and the old and odd, set well away from the family boards where the lantern light was brightest. Della took her place at the end of it without a flicker on her face and folded her hands. The Ashford woman's voice carried, as it was built to. Somewhere behind Della she heard it, pitched for the deacon's ear but not troubling much to stay there. We don't seat the washwoman with the family. There's an order to things, deacon, and the good Lord said it, not I. A small laugh. The clink of a good glass. Della did not turn. She had heard worse. She had heard it from finer mouths. She looked instead across the bright hall to the head table, where Elias Crandall sat with the banker on one side and the banker's daughter on the other, and where a man was rising now, with a glass in his hand, to give the toast of the evening. To Elias Crandall, the man said, and the Crandall spread, the pride of this valley and the pillar that holds up us all, long may it stand. And the whole hall stood and drank to it. 40 glasses lifted, 40 voices swelled, the lantern light running gold along all that silver. The pillar of the valley. Della sat at the far poor table, with her hands folded and her face still, and she alone in all that room knew the pillar was hollow. She had his father's watch in a tin on her mantel. She had the ruin of him written small in her book. She had lent the pride of the valley $80 at midnight so his men could be paid, and if she stood up now and said 10 words, the whole shining thing would come down in a heap of broken glass. She did not stand. She kept her silence like a hand cupped round a candle in the wind. She kept it for him, and she'd have said, if you'd asked her, that she kept it for herself, for her trade, for her rule. But that was less than half the truth now, and the watch on her mantel ticking through the empty house at night knew the rest of it. She watched Elias drink to his own hollow name with his jaw set like a man's swallowing gravel. And she watched him see her. Down the length of that bright hall he found her at the far dim table with the old and the poor, and she watched him understand, all at once, plain on his face, that she was sitting there in the cold end of the room, keeping the very silence that let this whole toast happen. That her discretion was the floor he was standing on, and that they had put her at the servants' table for the crime of being the one soul in Cold Fork he could trust. Something changed in his face. Della saw it happen, and did not know what it was, and it frightened her. The pie came out then, the grand pie of the evening, and by custom the first cut went to the guest of honor, to Elias himself, or to the lady on his arm. The Ashford girl half turned toward the plate, with the small, ready smile of a woman who expects to be served first all her life. Elias stood up. He did not take the pie. He took the whole plate, the first cut on it, and he stepped down from the head table. The fiddle scraped and quit. Every eye in the hall came round to him. He crossed the floor. He crossed it slow and steady in the sudden hush, past the banker, past the good glasses and the gold light and the 40 faces, all the long way down to the dim end of the room where the washwoman sat with her hands folded. He set the first cut of pie down in front of Della Marsh, in front of the whole valley. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, and his voice went to every corner of that silent hall. "You've the finest hands in Cold Fork and the best kept counsel. I'd be honored if you'd take the first cut tonight. You could have heard a pin drop into the snow outside." The Ashford woman's face went the color of tallow. Genevieve sat very straight with her empty smile freezing on her mouth. Somewhere a woman gasped like she'd been pinched. Della looked up at him, this great ruined man standing over her poor table with a pie in his hands and his whole reputation in the balance, and she could not for the life of her make her voice work. She only inclined her head, once, the way a queen might. The way she'd learned to hold herself through 8 years of being looked through. "Thank you, Mr. Crandall," she said, quiet. And the quiet of it went further than any shout. He nodded and turned and walked back to his place, and behind him the hall broke into a low roar of whisper, like water coming to the boil. The scandal was made. Right there, in front of everyone, the pillar of the valley had crossed the whole room to honor the laundress above the banker's daughter, and there was not a soul in Cold Fork who would sleep before they'd told it twice. Della sat with the pie she could not eat, and her heart going hard against her ribs, and she thought, with a kind of cold terror underneath the warmth she would not name, "He's undone us both. He didn't shield me. He's set us in the middle of the road for the wagons to run over." She was righter than she knew. The gossip crested on Main Street within the week and did not ebb. It grew. In the mercantile, the women who used to look through her now looked hard at her, which was worse. The washwoman who'd bewitched Elias Crandall. There must be something in it, they said. A man like that, a name like that, crossing a whole hall for a creature like her, there's something not decent in it. Mark me. Della walked the plank sidewalks with her chin level and her marketing basket on her arm, and let it break over her like weather. She'd survived worse weather. But she saw the way it landed on Elias, too. Saw it every time his wagon came down off the ridge. The men who used to hail him now measuring him. the banker's greeting gone thin and cool. She had cost him. Her silence had shielded him, and his one rash kindness had cost them both, and she did not know how to be sorry for a thing that had warmed her so. And into that talk came a new man, asking quiet questions. Della marked him first at the land office, a narrow fellow in a town coat who was not from the valley, Halloran's man, she learned, the speculator's clerk and eyes. He'd taken a room at the hotel, and he had a way of buying a drink for a talker and coming away knowing 3 things he hadn't known before. And what he was circling now, she could feel it, was the strange regard the ruined rancher held for the poor widow. A man like Halloran did not care who a rancher courted, unless there was money under it. Unless the widow knew a thing worth knowing. Della felt the cold of that. She was not a fool. If the wrong man ever wondered why Elias Crandall honored the laundress, the wrong man might go looking, and if he went looking, he might find a silver watch in a poor woman's tin and $80 written under 2 letters in a book, and from there it was one short step to the whole hollow truth of the Crandall spread laid open for a land shark to eat. She should have burned the page. She thought about it, standing by her stove of an evening with the ledger in her hands and the fire open and hungry. Burn the line and be safe. But the line was her lawful claim to $80 she'd bled for, and, she was honest enough to know it, the line was also the only thing that tied her to him. The only proof that once, at midnight, the pillar of the valley had needed Della Marsh and no one else. She closed the book. She did not burn it. She would come to think of that hour many times before the winter was through. The gestures started around then. She would not have called them courting. She would not have called them anything. But they gathered, the way small stitches gather into a seam. She came home one dusk to find her sagging porch step made right, the rotten board pulled, and a new one set, squared and nailed true. And she knew his carpentry the way she'd known his walk across the hall. He'd said not a word about it, and never would. She stood on the sound step in the cold and put her hand over her mouth and stood there longer than she'd like to say. In return, for she would not be beholden, she would not, that was the whole architecture of her soul, she took his one good coat when it came to her with a torn lining, the coat he'd worn to the social, and she did not just mend it. She turned the whole lining and set it right and worked into the collar a doubled seam that would outlast the man, and she did it by candle over 3 nights, and told herself it was only trade. She learned he took his coffee black and bitter, no sugar though sugar was there, because she'd poured it for him the second midnight he came, for he came again, careful, in the dark, to talk over the trouble now that they were bound in it, and she had it black and waiting the 3rd time without asking, and she saw him notice that she'd remembered, and saw him decide not to remark on it, and that not remarking passed between them heavier than speech. And she saw, one bad night, that he would not eat. He sat at her table with the plate cooling in front of him and his big hands flat on the wood and a grayness on him, and she knew without being told that the note had come due in his mind, that somewhere a clock she couldn't see was running down. She did not press him. She only moved the plate an inch closer and sat with him in it. The fed silence, she'd have called it if she'd named her own gestures, which she didn't. 2 people keeping each other company inside a fear too big to say. Trust in degrees. A step, a coat, a cup, a silence. And with every degree her old certainty cracked one hair further, the certainty that she needed no one, that safety lived in never being chosen. Because she was being chosen, wasn't she, in these small, wordless ways, and the terror of it was worse than the terror of the land shark. A land shark could only take her money. This could take the whole shape of the person she'd built to survive. Then, Halloran showed his hand. Elias came at the black end of a night in December, and he did not knock soft this time. He half fell through her door with the cold rolling off him and a paper crushed in his fist. She sat him down. She poured the black coffee, and he laid the paper flat on her table with a hand that shook, and she read it in the candlelight. It was a note. A second mortgage on the Crandall spread, and against it, over the first and legal claim of the bank, tucked behind it, quiet as a snake in cut grass, the name Halloran Land and Cattle Company. $2,000. And a date. 60 days. "He's holding my water," Elias said, low and terrible. "My father signed it in a bad year and never told me, and it fell to Halloran when he bought up the old paper. $2,000 in 60 days, or the spread is his, house and land, and the creek that feeds the whole valley below. He doesn't want the cattle, Della. He never wanted the cattle. He wants the water, and once he's got the Crandall Creek, he owns every ranch downstream by the throat." She read the note twice, slow, the way she read everything. $2,000. 60 days. And the clean ways out of it stood up plain in her mind, cold and clear as the note itself. He could marry the bank, Genevieve Ashford and her father's money, and the note quietly bought up and forgiven. And the Crandall name saved, and the whole ruin buried under a wedding. That was one road. The other road was public ruin, the spread on the auction block, the pillar of the valley thrown down for all to see, and a land shark drinking the creek. 2 roads. And on both of them, Della Marsh was nothing but a line in a book that had best be burned before it hanged them. She looked at him across her poor table, this proud, broken man who took his coffee black and had fixed her step in the dark, and she understood that she'd come to the edge of the thing she'd spent 8 years making sure she'd never come to. He was cornered. The sensible woman, the safe woman, the woman she had built, that woman would help him toward the Ashford marriage, would push him gentle toward the clean escape, would keep her $80 claim and her invisible dignity and let the banker's daughter save him, and would go on unchosen and untouched and safe forever. She opened her mouth to be that woman. She did not manage it, because just then, in the low light, she saw him press 2 fingers to his eyes like a man holding back something he could not afford to spend. And she heard him say, so quiet she nearly missed it, "I'd sooner lose it all than sit at that man's table and let him think he bought me." And she knew, plain, the way she knew everything, that he would not take the clean escape, that his pride, the same pride that had nearly killed him, would let him drown before it let him be bought. And she knew that if she said nothing, if she kept her careful silence one more time, she would be helping him toward a wedding that would cost him his whole soul, or an auction that would cost him his whole name. For 8 years her silence had been her strength. That night, for the first time, silence was the coward's road, and she saw it, and it turned her stomach. But she did not act yet. Not that night. She let him go back up the ridge with the note in his fist, and she sat a long time by the dead fire, turning it all over. And it was the next morning that the narrow man came to her door. Halloran's clerk stood on her new porch step, hat in hand, smiling the smile of a man who has done his sums and likes the answer. He did not waste her time. He knew, he said, that she and Mr. Crandall were friendly. He knew a woman in her position had cares. He was authorized, that was the word he used, authorized, to see that a helpful woman's cares were eased. All she need do was remember rightly, if it ever came to a hearing, what she knew of the Crandall affairs. Or better yet, remember nothing at all. There was money in remembering rightly. There was more in a book, he said, and his eyes went past her to the shelf, if she had a book, that a careful man might want to buy outright. Della stood in her own doorway and looked at that smiling man, and 8 years of being looked through burned off her like frost off glass. "Get off my step," she said. "It's new. I'd not have it fouled." He kept smiling. He named a figure. It was a great deal of money, more than the 80, more than she'd see in a year of mending, enough to be safe on. Enough to build her wall 3 feet higher, all for a book and a slack memory. "I heard you the first time," Della said. "Now hear me. There's no book, there's no memory, and there's no price. Take your hat down off my porch, and take your master's coin back where it came from, and tell him the washwoman said so." The smile went out of him like a lamp. He put his hat on. "You'll be sorry, missus," he said, and it was near the very words Elias had once used at that same door, only turned inside out, and she marked the difference. A hearing's a public thing. Folks'll want to know why a rich man crosses a hall for a poor one. When it comes out, and it will, you'll not be the woman he honored. You'll be the schemer that trapped him. Think on it." He went, and Della stood on her sound step in the killing cold and did think on it, and every word he'd said was true, and none of it moved her the way he'd meant it to. Because she'd made her choice while he was still talking. She'd made it, if she was honest, the night before, watching Elias press his fingers to his eyes. The land shark was moving now, tonight, with money and a hearing and shame all loaded like a gun, and Elias did not know it. Elias was up on his ridge choosing between two roads and did not know a third man was greasing the wheels underneath him. He had to be told. Tonight, before the clerk's coin found some weaker mouth in the valley, before the trap sprung with Elias still blind to who was pulling it. She looked at the sky. It had gone the low iron color that means snow in Montana, real snow, the killing kind, and the wind was already coming down off the high ground with an edge on it. No one with sense would ride up to the Crandall Ridge tonight. It was miles of open country and the first true storm of the winter coming on fast, and a woman alone on the poor-side sway-backed mare had no business in it. Della went inside. She took down the tin from the mantel and set the silver watch aside careful, and under where the watch had lain, back of the tin, she took out the other thing. The roll of coin and small bills, 8 years of it, every dollar scraped and hidden, the whole wall she'd built between herself and ever needing anyone. Her freedom, folded small. She'd never spent a cent of it. She'd never meant to. It was the thing that made her safe. She stood there in the cold house with her freedom in one hand and the watch in the other, and she understood exactly what she was about to do, and exactly what it would cost, and she did it anyway. She put on her dead husband's heavy coat over her own. She wound the watch and slid it into her breast pocket where she could feel it tick. She put the roll of money deep in the other. And she went out to the lean-to and saddled the mare in the failing light, while the first hard flakes came stinging sideways out of the iron sky, and she swung up, and she turned the old horse's head toward the high white ridge, where the pillar of the valley sat alone in his ruin, not yet knowing that the poorest woman in Cold Fork was riding out through the teeth of the storm to save him, with the last of her own safety folded warm against her heart. The wind took the door of the lean-to and slammed it behind her like a shot. And Della Marsh rode up into the dark and the snow, toward the one thing she'd sworn for 8 years she would never do. The ridge was gone. The whole world had gone white and moving, and the trail Della knew by heart had rubbed itself out under the snow like a name off a stone. She rode with her chin down, and the wind at her cheek, and the mare picking its own way, because the mare had more sense in this than she did. Her hands stopped being hands. The watch ticked against her breast, small and steady, the one warm thing in all that dark. She thought about turning back. She thought about it the way you think about a warm room from the bottom of a well. And then she thought about Elias Crandall, sitting up there in the ruin of his father's house, too proud to see the pit under his boots, and she leaned into the storm and kept on. The light came at her out of the snow before she believed it. A window, yellow and low and swimming. She turned the mare toward it, and the mare found the fence line, and then the yard, and then the door was there, and she was falling more than climbing down, her legs dead beneath her. She beat on the door with the side of her fist because her fingers wouldn't close. It opened on the second blow. Elias stood there with the lamp behind him, and for a moment he didn't know her. A shape out of the blizzard, snow to the waist, a dead man's coat frozen stiff. Then he did. Della. Just her name. He'd never said it before. He took her arm and pulled her in out of the wind, and the door slammed, and the sudden still was louder than the storm had been. "You'll die of this," he said. "What in God's name? Halloran's moving." Her lips barely worked. "His man came to me. He's not waiting the 60 days. He means to shame you out of the water before you can raise the note." Elias stood very still. The lamp threw his shadow long across the bare floor. The great front room of the Crandall house was near empty now. She saw it in one look, the good furniture gone to auction quiet. One chair, one table, a cold stove he'd only just fed for her coming. "Sit," he said. "You're blue." He put her in the one chair by the stove and knelt and pulled her frozen boots off her frozen feet and chafed them between his two hands, this pillar of the valley, on his knees before the washwoman on his own cold floor. She let him. She was past pride herself just then. When the feeling came back into her, it came back like fire, and she made a small sound, and he held on until it passed. "His clerk offered me money," she said when she could. "To remember rightly." That's how he put it. "To say what the widow knows. Or to sell him my book." She looked at the fire. "I told him no. Then I thought, telling you no isn't enough. He'll find another way. He always finds another way. A man like that." She reached into the deep pocket of the dead man's coat, and her fingers were clumsy, and she brought out the roll. Coin and small bills, bound in a rag, 8 years thick. She set it on the table between them. "That's mine," she said. "Every dollar. It's not 2,000. It's not near, but it's a wall against the 60 days, and I'd rather it stood between you and Halloran than sat in my tin doing nothing but making me feel safe." Elias looked at the roll on the table. He didn't reach for it. When he lifted his eyes to her, they were wet, and he was a man who'd have died before he let the town see that. "You rode through that," he said, "to bring me your last dollar. I rode through that to keep a cheat from taking the water off every poor family downstream of you," she said. "You're only part of it, Elias Crandall. Don't flatter yourself." He laughed. It broke out of him rough, half a sob, and that was the thing that turned between them in that cold room. Not the money, not the storm. The laugh. Two proud people who'd each spent a life needing no one, sitting in a ruin, laughing so they wouldn't do the other thing. "I can't take your money," he said. "You can and you will," she said. "But not tonight. Tonight I'm too froze to argue, and you're too proud to lose. Tomorrow we'll be smaller and we'll settle it." She looked at him. "Have you eaten?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. She'd known it since the door. The note weighed on him, and a man like Elias wouldn't eat when he couldn't pay. She got up on her ruined feet and went to his cold pantry and found what there was, which was little, and she made it into supper because that was a thing she knew how to do when there was nothing else to be done. He watched her move around his kitchen, and something in his face eased that hadn't eased in weeks. The storm shut them in 3 days. There was no help for it, and no shame in it, out here, with the drifts to the eaves. She slept in the one good bed, and he slept by the stove, and neither said a word about it. And in those 3 days, snowed in with the ledger of his ruin, they did the thing that saved him. Because Della Marsh could read numbers. She'd kept her own book 8 years, coin by coin, and no eye but hers had ever read it, and there was not a woman in Cold Fork who could untangle a column faster. And on the second day, going through Halloran's paper spread across the table, the note, the terms, the interest reckoned out in the speculator's own tight hand, she went still. "Bring the lamp closer," she said. Elias brought it. She had a stub of pencil and the back of an old bill, and she was working the figures, and working them again, her lips moving. "What is it?" he said. "His arithmetic." She tapped the note. "Read me the principal." 2,000. "And the interest he's charging." He read it off. "Now," she said, "reckon it honest." And she showed him, the pencil going, the sums laid bare. "That's what 2,000 at his own rate comes to over the term." And that, she tapped his figure, is what he's written down for you to pay. You see the difference? Elias bent over the paper. His mouth moved. And then he looked up at her, and the color had gone out of his face, and something hard had come into it. He's padded it, he said. $300. He's charging me interest on interest and called it principal. He's a cheat, Della said simply. Cheats always overreach. They can't help it. He never thought a rancher would read close, and he sure never thought a laundress would read it for him. She set the pencil down. This note's fraudulent on its face. Elias, any judge with his glasses on can see it. You've been so busy being ashamed you forgot to be careful. He sat back. For the first time since the herd began to die, Elias Crandall looked like a man who might live. You've saved me, he said. I've found the door, she said. You've still got to walk through it. And Halloran won't stand quiet while you do. The storm broke on the fourth morning, hard blue sky, and the whole valley blinding white, and she rode down before full light so no eye in Cold Fork would count the days she'd been up on the ridge. But eyes count anyway. They always do. What followed was 6 weeks of quiet, careful war, and it was fought in centimeters. She could not be seen going to him, and he could not be seen coming to her, so they passed like strangers on Main Street and did their business in the margins. He mended the sagging step on her back porch one night with his own hands and left before she woke, and she found it firm under her foot in the morning and knew who. She took his one good coat, the black wool he wore to town, worn through at the elbow, and she darned it so fine you'd never find the seam, and left it folded on his wagon seat, with no note. He learned she took her coffee black and bitter and never said so, and set a cup that way in front of her the one time she came to the land office when he was there. Before a clerk, casual, like it was nothing, and it was everything. The town watched Genevieve Ashford drive out to the Crandall spread in her father's good buggy, and the town nodded to itself. There it is. The pillar will wed the banker's girl, and the ranch will be saved, and the world will right itself. And the ladies were satisfied. And Genevieve was not cruel. She'd been raised to a duty, and she meant to do it, and she looked at Elias like a thing already owned. She nearly caught it once. She came up unannounced and saw the coat folded on the wagon and the darn in it. And she held it a long moment, and something crossed her face. But she was too well bred to ask, and she set it down. Halloran's clerk near caught them worse. At the land office, over the plats, Della bent close to show Elias where the water line ran on the old survey, and the narrow man in the town coat came in the door behind them, and they broke apart a half-second too slow. The clerk looked at the widow. He looked at the rancher. And Della watched the arithmetic move behind his flat eyes, and knew he'd take it back to Halloran, and knew the come to a head was near. It came in December, in the courthouse at Cold Fork, before the circuit judge. Halloran filed to foreclose. He couldn't wait the deadline out, not with Della's savings in it and the water so near his hand, so he moved to take the spread on the note as it stood, and he came to town himself to do it. Silas Halloran, a big soft man in a good coat, with a voice made for rooms, and no valley of his own because he'd never built a thing, only bought the ruins of men who had. The hearing room filled. 40 faces, and Della knew every one. The same faces from the harvest social, the banker Ashford and his wife in the front bench, Genevieve pale beside them, the deacon, the ladies who looked through her on the street. They'd come to watch the pillar fall. Even a valley that loves a man will come to watch him fall. Della sat in the back, where a laundress sat, with her ledger in her lap under her shawl. Halloran's lawyer laid it out smooth. The note, the default, the terms. And then Halloran himself stood, because he could not resist it, and he turned to the room. And he played the card he'd carried all along. "Your Honor," he said, "there's a matter of character wants airing. This valley holds up Elias Crandall as its finest man. I'd ask them to know how their finest man kept himself afloat this year." He let it hang. He didn't come to the bank. No, he went, in the dark, at midnight, to a woman on the poor side of town. A washerwoman. He borrowed money from the laundress, and he gave her his dead father's watch to hold, and she keeps a book of it. He turned, and he pointed one soft finger straight down the room at Della Marsh. She keeps a book of every man's shame in this valley. And I'd ask the court to have her produce it, so we may all see what manner of woman the great Crandall crawls to, and what manner of man crawls. The room turned. 40 faces turned and found her in the back, and she felt them land like stones. The judge looked over his glasses. Does the woman have such a book? And there it was. The whole trap sprung clean. Della understood it in one breath, sitting still with her hands folded on the shawl. If she stood and produced the ledger, she cleared her lawful $80 and her own good name. See, it's a debt honestly kept, honestly recorded, but the page said $80. EC, and reading it out would brand Elias forever as the man who begged from the washwoman, would shatter the Crandall name in the mouths of these 40, and would brand her too, the schemer, the spider who trapped a fine man in her web. Halloran had built it so that the truth and the lie wore the same dress. If she burned it, if she let the page go, she lost her claim, lost her $80, lost her vindication, and could be called a liar to her face with nothing to answer. But the Crandall name would stand. She looked at Elias. And Elias Crandall, cornered, proud, and terrified, for her, though she couldn't know it, did the thing that broke her heart. He stood up. He would not look at her. He looked at the judge, and he spoke loud enough for all 40 to hear. Your Honor, this is a slander and a distraction. I don't know what book Mr. Halloran means. The widow Marsh is nothing to me, a laundress I've barely spoken to. I won't have my father's name dragged through the gutter alongside a washerwoman's account book. Try the note or dismiss it, but leave the poor woman out of your schemes. He meant it as a shield. He meant, don't tie yourself to me, don't drown when I go down, I'll carry it alone. He'd have cut off his own hand before he shamed her. But shame doesn't check a man's intent. It only hears the words. And what Della Marsh heard, sitting in the back with his father's watch ticking against her heart, was this: the widow Marsh is nothing to me. She heard him choose the room. She heard him choose Genevieve and the front bench and the standing his father left him. She heard 8 years of never needing anyone proved right in a single sentence, and something in her that had risked opening closed over quiet, like water over a dropped stone. She stood up. Every eye followed. There's no book, Your Honor, she said. Her voice did not shake. Mr. Halloran's mistaken. I mend and I wash. I've no account with any man in this valley. She gathered her shawl. May I be excused? I've work waiting. The judge waved her out. Halloran's face was a study, the trap sprung on empty air, the widow slipping the noose by cutting her own rope. And she walked the length of that room, past all 40 of them, past Ashford and his wife, past Genevieve, past Elias, who still would not lift his eyes, and she walked out the courthouse door into the cold, with her chin level and her back straight, and not one of them saw what it cost. She went home to her cold house. She built up the stove. And she took the ledger down from the shelf and opened it to the page, her whole small, honest record, and near the top, in her own careful hand, $80. E.C. Her lawful claim. Her $80, her proof and her vindication and the money that stood between her and ever needing anyone. She tore the page out clean. She held it a moment. And she opened the stove door, and she fed the page into the fire, and she watched her name for the money and his name for the shame curl up together and go to ash. She'd sworn 8 years she'd never spend her safety on any soul. She spent it there, in silence, on a man who'd just called her nothing. She said one thing, alone, to the empty room, and it was not bitter, only true. A debt and a secret are the only 2 things I own outright, said Della Marsh. I don't spend either where folks can hear." And she shut the stove. She thought that was the end of it. It was not. Because two things happened that she did not see. The first was Genevieve Ashford. She had watched Elias Crandall stand and disown a woman, with his eyes on the floor, and Genevieve was entitled and dutiful, but she was not a fool, and she knew the sound of a man lying to save someone. She'd held the darned coat. She'd seen his face, and she understood, sitting there in the front bench meant for her, that whatever was between the rancher and the laundress, it was not nothing, and it never would be hers. She was too proud to want a man who loved his lie better than her truth. The second was Halloran's own clerk, the narrow man who, with the widow gone and the book denied, grew nervous and leaned to whisper to his master that perhaps the note had best not go before the judge's glasses after all. Halloran waved him off. Arrogance can't hear its own clerk. And the third thing, because there are always three, was that Elias Crandall could not live with what he'd done. He found out about the page that night. The clerk, hedging his bets, let it slip in the saloon that the widow had gone straight home from the court, and a boy who cut wood for her had seen her burning papers in her stove and crying, which the widow Marsh had not done in front of a living soul in 8 years. It reached Elias by midnight. And Elias, who had disowned her to save her, understood in one sick rush that she had burned her own $80, her lawful claim, her freedom, her proof, rather than say one word that would touch his father's name. That she had heard nothing, and answered it with the greatest thing she owned. He did not sleep. And in the morning, when the hearing reconvened, Elias Crandall walked into that courthouse, a different man. The room was full again. Word had spread that the pillar would fall today, and the valley does love a fall. Halloran sat fat and easy. The judge took his bench. And before the lawyer could say a word, Elias stood and took off his hat and held it in his 2 hands like a boy at a graveside. "Your Honor, before you try this note, I've a thing to say, and I'll say it plain, because I told a lie in this room yesterday and it's been eating me alive since." The room hushed. Ashford's wife leaned forward. Everything Silas Halloran said yesterday was true. Elias's voice was steady, and it carried. The Crandall herd is dead. Drought took half, and the winter took the rest, and this spread my father built has been hollow as a drum since spring, and I've spent this whole year lying to every soul in this valley about it, because I was too proud to be seen falling. He looked around the room, face by face. "You toasted me at the harvest social as the pillar of the valley. I stood there and let you, with my father's watch already in another's keeping and 80 borrowed dollars keeping my men fed. Nobody breathed. When the herd died, I couldn't go to the bank, because the bank answers to that man." He nodded at Halloran, and going to the bank meant handing him the water. No respectable hand in this valley would help me, because no respectable hand knew, because I was too proud to ask. So I went, at midnight, in the dark, to the one person in Cold Fork poor enough to understand ruin and proud enough to keep it quiet. I went to the widow Marsh, and she counted $80 in silver into my hand and asked me not one prying question, and took my father's watch to hold, and wrote it small in a book, and she kept my secret through the whole year while every one of you looked through her on the street like she was a pane of glass. Della was not in the room. She was home at her washtub, not knowing. "Yesterday," Elias said, and his voice cracked, and he made it hold. "Yesterday that man tried to use her decency as a whip to flog me with, and I panicked, and I stood in this room, and I called that woman nothing. The finest soul in this valley, and I called her nothing, to save my father's name." He drew a breath. "Well, I'd rather my father's name went to the devil than buy it at that price. Here's the truth of it. When I had nothing, and everyone, she had little, and gave it all. And last night, sooner than say one word in open court that would touch the Crandall name. That woman took her own book to her own stove and burned her own lawful claim to $80. Her savings, her proof, everything she'd bled 8 years for, burned it to ash so I'd not be shamed. She spent her whole safety on a man who'd just disowned her. And I will not stand in this valley one more hour and let it be said she is nothing. He reached into his coat, and he brought out the silver pocket watch, his father's watch, that she had kept for him and wound every night and never once thought to sell, and he set it on the rail before the judge, where all 40 could see it shine. "That's hers," he said. "The $80 is hers, and I'll pay it in gold the day I have gold. And the day this spread is clear, half of it goes into her name, before it goes anywhere near Silas Halloran, because she saved it, and no man in this room lifted a finger but her." The silence broke into noise, and the judge gavelled it down. "That's a fine speech," said Halloran, rising, his voice not so smooth now. "It changes nothing. The note stands. The money's owed. Sentiment doesn't pay a mortgage, Your Honor. I'll have my foreclosure." And that was when the courthouse door opened, and Della Marsh came in. She'd been sent for. The woodboy, on Elias's coin, had ridden hard. She came in with her sleeves still wet from the tub and her shawl thrown on crooked, and she stopped just inside the door, and she looked at Elias standing there hat in hand, and she looked at his father's watch shining on the rail, and she could not make sense of it. Elias looked at her across the whole length of that room, across all 40 faces, and he did not drop his eyes this time. He held them. "Say what you found in his note," he said gently. "Tell the judge. It's the last thing, and then it's done." And Della Marsh understood that he had told them everything, that the secret she'd carried was lying open on the floor of the courthouse, where he'd laid it himself, on purpose, to unshame her, that he'd traded his father's name for her good one in front of the very people who'd shut her out. She walked up the aisle. She did not hurry, and she stood before the judge, this laundress in a wet apron, and she said, "May I see the note?" "Your Honor?" They gave it to her. She held it up. "The arithmetic's false," she said. "Mr. Halloran's charged interest upon his interest and folded it into the principal and called the whole thing money owed. Reckoned honest, at his own stated rate, the sum comes $300 short of what he's written here. He's padded the note, and a padded note's a fraudulent note, and I'd ask the court to reckon it for itself." She set it down. "I keep a careful book, Your Honor. Or I did. I know false figures when I read them." The judge put on his other glasses and took the note and a pencil, and the room waited while a circuit judge did sums, and the only sound was the scratch of his lead. Halloran's soft face had gone the color of tallow. His clerk was edging toward the door. The judge looked up. "Mr. Halloran," he said, "your own hand condemns you. This note is padded by better than $300 and reckoned to defraud. I find it void on its face." He struck it with his pen. "The foreclosure is dismissed, and I'll be writing to the territorial court about your manner of doing business, sir. You'll not file another note in this county." Halloran opened his mouth. Nothing came. He gathered his good coat around his soft body, and he looked at the 40 faces of a valley that had just watched him unmasked, and he found not one friend in it. His clerk was already gone out the door. Halloran followed him, and at the threshold he stopped and turned, as men like him must, to leave with a word. "You've none of you the sense to be rich," he said. "A watch and a wet apron. You deserve each other." And that was the best he had. He went out, and the door swung shut on Silas Halloran, and the West swallowed him, a cheat gone west to cheat some other valley, with no water and no note and no name worth the salt in it. The room let out its breath all at once. And Elias Crandall crossed the floor. He crossed it the way he'd crossed the harvest social, straight and slow, and this time the whole valley knew why. He came to Della, where she stood by the judge's rail, and he took up his father's watch, and he did not put it in his own pocket. He held it out to her on his open palm. It was collateral, he said, low, just for her, though the room strained to hear. Then it was the only thing of my father's I had left worth keeping. I want it to be a gift. I want you to keep it not because I owe you, but because I can't do the rest of my life without the woman who wound it every night when I'd given up. His voice was not steady now, and he let it not be. I called you nothing to save you. It was the worst lie I ever told, and the truest thing I know is the opposite. You're the whole of it, Della. Stay, one word. The contained declaration. Stay. And Della Marsh, who had built a wall coin by coin for 8 years so that she would never in this life have to need one living soul, who had ridden through a killing storm to give that wall away and then watched it burn in her own stove. Della Marsh looked at the watch on his open hand, and at the 40 faces of the people who'd looked through her, and at the one face that finally, plainly, saw her. Her blind spot melted like frost off a window. She let herself be chosen. I'll stay, she said. And she took the watch. And she closed his hand around hers over it, before the whole town of Cold Fork. And there was not a thing the banker's wife could do but sit and watch it happen. On the courthouse steps the snow was starting again, soft this time, no teeth in it. The valley came out into it slow. Changed, Mrs. Ashford came down the steps stiff as a fence post, and she had to pass the pair of them, the rancher and the laundress. And she had to watch Elias Crandall settle his coat around Della Marsh's shoulders like she was made of china. The banker's wife had shut this woman out of every parlor in Cold Fork. Now she inclined her head, a small, tight, forced-out nod, because the whole valley was watching, and there was nothing else left to do. Della gave her back the same nod, level and unbothered, one woman to another. And that was all. No triumph in it. Della had never needed the triumph. She'd only needed her own 2 feet, and she'd always had those. Genevieve Ashford came last. She stopped before Elias, and she was pale but she was composed, and she'd salvaged her pride by being the one to end it clean. I think we understand each other, Mr. Crandall, she said. I wish you both very well. Truly. And she meant the truly, mostly, and she gave Della a nod that had more real respect in it than her mother's, and she went to her father's buggy with her back straight. The match dissolved without a scene, the way well-bred things do. And down at the foot of the steps stood Amos Pell, the storekeeper, the widower who'd courted Della steady and decent for 2 years and never once won a smile more than a friend's. He'd come to the hearing. He'd heard all of it. And he looked at the 2 of them there in the falling snow, and he understood, the way a kind man understands a thing that costs him, and he touched his hat brim to Della Marsh. Miss Della, he said. He's a lucky man, and I hope he knows it. He'd better, Della said, and she said it soft, to spare him, and Amos Pell smiled a small, sad, honest smile, and stepped back and let her go. A good man, stepping aside. It made her choosing cost something, and the cost is what made it real. Spring came late to the high country, the way it always does, and then it came all at once. The creek broke loose off the Crandall Ridge in a brown roar and ran full down the valley, past every ranch below, the water free and no man's to sell. The thaw came up the fields, and the first green with it, and the Crandall spread, half of it in the name of Della Marsh now, drawn up lawful and plain, began the slow work of coming back to life. New stock on the note the bank finally, gladly gave the honest man. Fences mended by 2 pairs of hands. In the Crandall kitchen there was a table, and on the table there was a ledger. Open, not a hidden one. Not a secret one kept for no eye but hers. An honest book in the daylight, and anyone might read it, because Della Marsh had no more secrets in Cold Fork worth the keeping. The $80 was in it, paid, in Elias's own hand, in gold, the way he'd promised. And on the mantel over the kitchen stove sat the silver watch ticking. She wound it some nights. He wound it others. It had been collateral. And then it had been trust. And now it was only what it looked like. An old man's watch, kept warm in a house with a fire in it, marking the good ordinary time of two people who had each stopped being alone. Silas Halloran was gone west, they heard, and gone broke behind that, a cheat run clean out of valleys to fool. The banker Ashford tipped his hat to Elias in the street now, and his wife nodded to Della at church, a real nod these days, worn smooth by use. And the strangest thing, the thing Della would smile at quiet when it happened, was this: the respectable women of Cold Fork, the very ones who'd remarked upon her mended dress and would not seat her with the family, they began to bring their mending to her door. Not because she needed the work. Everyone knew she didn't. Now, they brought it to be seen at her door. To be able to say they'd stood in Elias Crandall's kitchen. The valley's ladder had turned itself over, and the woman at the bottom of it was at the top, and she'd never climbed a rung. The ladder had just come round to where she'd been standing all along. She wore no finer dress. She'd earned finer, and she didn't want it. She sat at the family table, because that was where she sat now, plain as ever, the watch ticking on the mantel, and the honest book open on the boards, and the man across from her who'd learned, too late and just in time, that a name is worth nothing, and a soul is worth everything. Some debts get paid in silver, coin counted cold into an open hand at midnight, and some debts get paid across a whole life, in mended steps and black coffee and a word held back until it's the only word that matters. The loud ones, the world remembers. But it's the quiet ones that count double. The kept secret, the burned page, the safety spent without a sound on someone who didn't yet deserve it. Della Marsh kept a debt and a secret. The only two things she owned outright, and she spent them both, in the end, exactly where no one could hear, and got back the one thing 8 years of never needing had never once bought her. If you've ever been the one they looked through, the plain one, the poor one, the one at the servants' table, then you already know how this story ends, because it's yours too. Tell me the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far the quiet ones travel.